Greetings from Emirates College for Advanced Education. Welcome to the 5th episode of ECAE Podcast Spotlight. In celebration of Reading Month, we gather today to explore the fascinating world of reading and the brain. This episode features a very special guest, Dr. Armando Bertone. Dr. Armando is a research scientist in the Children and Adolescents Mental Health Research Program of the Integrated University Health and Social Services Center of Nord-de-l'Île de Montréal and a licensed neuropsychologist. Dr. Armando holds patents originating from his lab-based work in the field of neuroscience. Also joining us today, Dr. Claudine Habak, Associate Professor in the Division of Language, Cognition and Growth of Emirates College for Advanced Education. From the cognitive neuroscientific lens, Dr. Claudine's research investigates the link between perception and cognition and its changes across the lifespan, from child development to aging. In this episode, we will explore how educators can apply neuroscience-informed strategies to enhance the complex cognitive skills involved in reading, highlighting how the brain processes and makes meaning out of written text. Whether you're an educator, researcher, policymaker, or simply someone who is passionate about literacy development, this conversation promises to offer valuable perspectives on how we can bridge the gap between neuroscience and educational practice. Stay tuned for an enlightening discussion on reading and the brain and how we can utilize knowledge about the neuroscience of reading to create more inclusive and effective learning environments for all learners. Dr. Armando, welcome to ECAE and welcome to Abu Dhabi.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be here.
Good to have you here. Dr. Claudine, welcome to ECAE Podcast Spotlight.
Thank you, Dr. Farah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, and I'm so excited for this episode. It's such a lovely topic, very important topic, reading and the brain. So let's start by shedding light on the importance of learning to read and becoming an efficient reader. So this question is for both of you, if you don't mind. Why, in your opinion, and we'll start with Dr. Armando. Why, in your opinion, do educators and caregivers need to focus on promoting reading in children across the board?
Sure. So, generally speaking, reading is the main vehicle for instruction, and it's part of pedagogy. And it's basically it's a skill that's developed over time. And basically, when you're instructed to learn about different domains, usually you have to know how to read efficiently, whether it's reading quickly or understanding what you're reading. So it's kind of like a basis of learning, if you will.
So it's the key to overall academic success, right?
Well, yes.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Armando. Dr. Claudine, do you want to add something about that?
Yes, it's also our starting point to be able to explore the world. So it gives us a starting point for conversation and for deeper understanding of concepts and things that can apply and connect us to the world. So it's a way to spark a conversation and thinking, which is necessary for our life skills.
Mm-hmm. And I want to touch here on well-being. So if the child struggles with reading, how does that affect his overall or her overall well-being?
Right. So it can, of course, affect many children who struggle with something can have a bit of less confidence because they're worried about how they may look to others or just because they're struggling themselves. So of course it can affect their well-being. So we always want to make sure to be able to support those areas so that they feel good about themselves and are not afraid to learn something even if it's difficult, because it can expand to other areas as well.
Amazing. And now let's delve into the brain, the topic of the brain, which is the main theme of our episode. So the human brain is complicated. Everyone kind of agrees with that. It's very complicated, and our understanding of it is constantly evolving. It keeps evolving, right? As are our theories of how the brain learns how to read, or how the brain works during the reading process. So Dr. Armando, can you tell us a little bit more when and how the human brain learns how to read?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, the human brain is kind of involved in everything. I'm kind of being biased as a neuroscientist, but most often important information that is important for, especially to communicate, there's dedicated functions in the brain, or even like areas of the brain that are dedicated to that specific function. For example, there's an area in the brain that's specifically developed to process faces and emotions. That's very important. And the same thing is the case for language. So one of the few lateralized functions of the brain is language processing. So the left side of the brain is more involved in processing language. So that by default suggests that understanding language, communicating, and therefore reading is a really fundamental process that our brain is genetically programmed to do. So it's extremely important.
It's very important to understand the involvement of the brain functioning in reading, because many times teachers, if a student is struggling, some teachers may think the student is not trying hard enough, or they're just being lazy, they're not trying hard enough. Yes, so it's important to know that it's not a matter of free will and choice, right?
Absolutely. I think our brain is like our fingerprints. Yes, we all have different fingerprints and we all have different brains. So it's important to acknowledge the fact that we all do things. Some of us do things very well, and some of us less well. So and when a child is struggling in a certain area, for example, reading, most often it's how their brain is working. So they're not reading well on purpose, or they're not motivated to read, at least initially. It's just that their neural abilities are not efficient enough for them to read like their peers. So it's very important to understand this and communicate this to both the learner and their family, so that there's the guilt of not performing as well as their peers is kind of taken off their shoulders, and that perception of them being lazy or not wanting to kind of disappears, and then the focus is put on accommodating the learner and giving them the tools to ameliorate their ability to read, for example.
It's very, very important for educators, parents, and learners themselves to learn about this, coming from a neuroscientist like yourself. And now I'm going to move to a related topic with Dr. Claudine. We know, many people know, especially educators, that reading involves a complex set of cognitive skills. It's not just simple, it's not the skill of reading, it's actually a complex set of skills, starting from breaking down words into sounds, fluency and automaticity with text, processing of speech and production of speech, right? Comprehending language and monitoring your own comprehension. How do these skills interact, and how do they differentially relate in relation to reading outcomes?
Well, it's a very interesting question, actually. It's a very big question. But basically, if you take each of those components, we actually, there are tests like neuropsychological tests and things like that, so that we can actually figure out which of these parts is like the targeted test, so that we can figure out if it's one of these functions or more where the difficulty is arising from. So we can, those are things that can be done. The important thing is that, of course, they all work together. We need all of these components to be able to read and express ourselves. And I think one of the things that is really important to point out here is kind of the last two that you mentioned, like, comprehension, comprehension and monitoring our own comprehension. So those are two things that really feed into what we call executive function skills, or our kind of higher order thinking levels. And those are very important, because when we get to that stage and we're able to monitor ourselves and really understand what we're what we're reading and how, because then we can start thinking of advanced ideas and concepts and so on. And when we're able to monitor those skills and really work on those executive functions, it actually helps us with our reading as well. So it's kind of a loop where you get to the higher level and it actually helps you with the simpler things as well.
With reading fluency, you're kind of a more fluent reader if you have a more efficient comprehension skills.
Exactly, yeah.
And Dr.
Absolutely, I totally agree with Dr. Habak. It's an extremely complex function. Like, we take it for granted once we become efficient readers, how easy it is, quote unquote, to read a paragraph. There's visual processing involved. There's, again, self-monitoring involved. There's your eyes are scanning and sometimes not scanning. There's this ability to recognize words like super quickly. I'm talking about milliseconds. And quite often when a child presents with reading difficulties, especially language comprehension, there's also comorbid executive functioning, maybe difficulty like attention, for example. So above and beyond being able to read or decode words, sometimes when a child has a reading comprehension issue, it might not simply be because of the language, but also a working memory, for example, difficulty, where after reading the first two lines of a paragraph, the information in the first line is forgotten, for example.
Yes, the information.
So as Dr. Habak mentioned, there has to be like this comprehensive evaluation of different functions, not just the reading per se, but also functions that are related to comprehension or fluency, for example. And one of them is attention, working memory, and other types of executive functioning.
Very, very interesting. And some of these skills we learn from teachers or parents or maybe observing other peers, but other skills come naturally. Like, for example, I don't remember being taught that when you don't understand or when your reading comprehension breaks down, maybe when you reread, that's a strategy. Like, oh, maybe if I reread the sentence before this sentence, I will be able, some of these things we kind of learn on our own naturally. But my question is do all children find it easy to self-learn or self-teach these skills?
I could maybe have a first crack at this.
Please, Dr. Arman.
It depends. So sometimes when kids whose brain works differently are able to perform, i.e. read, as well as their peers, there's a lot more effort invested into reading at that same level. So, for example, it might be more scanning or more effort and concentration to read the same amount of text. So, although the reading skill level is very high, there might be a disproportionate amount of effort to be at that level for one child. And for another child or reader, it just might come naturally. We take a lot of things for granted. Our brain does incredible things and it's seamless. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves of how efficient our brain works, including reading. So again, when a reader starts falling behind their peers, it could be like a bad grade on an English test, or actually not, or failing a grade because of reading. This is when then an assessment is warranted. And what we do as neuropsychologists, for example, we find what they can do well and less well. And not just emphasize the deficits, but also see what the child could do well and then work with those tools.
Excellent. Yeah, this is amazing. So you follow the capability model for special education. Dr. Claudine, you want to add something about this, the automaticity and the self-learning?
Yeah, so one thing you mentioned, which is, some of us may monitor and go back and reread and say, oh, I'm not too sure. So let me pull on the context before that. So, of course, struggling readers may not necessarily engage in those types of things, but it's certainly something that can be taught.
Okay.
So it's certainly something that educators or, special educators can certainly sit with children and teach them those skills. So it's explicit teaching of those skills and really get them to practice that. And then, of course, the children will do that on their own eventually. And that's how you can see improvements in some of these.
Amazing. This is very promising. And I think that we can follow up on this discussion about special education practices to support students who struggle in reading. Now let's go to the next question to Dr. Armando. Unlike general language development, such as language comprehension, production of speech, reading has been described by scholars as a set of concurrent constructs that require explicit, which we were talking about, systematic teaching practices for it to develop effectively. Do you agree with this claim? If you do, why? And if you don't, can you please offer other perspectives about teaching reading?
So it all depends on the curriculum being offered to the student, and if the student is able to follow the curriculum and is able to flourish within that set of instructional environment. Right? When things go well, everything goes well. When things go less well, then there's adaptations to be implemented.
Absolutely.
And so this is how I would see this. As a neuropsychologist, we work less with teachers, but we offer teachers and professionals the learner's toolbox, so what they could do well and less well. So, for example, some kids have difficulty with matching what's written on the word, the graphemes and phonemes, right? But they do other things well, like recognize words very efficiently. So, if a child, and we have tests to kind of figure this out.
For dyslexia, right?
For dyslexia, and we have tests to kind of figure this out. So we could suggest to the educator or the teacher to use specific approaches. So, for example, more visually based, right? To kind of help the learner read text and comprehend the text within a specific amount of time, and hopefully there's accommodations that are offered to the students so that they have more time to do the same work as someone who doesn't have a challenge.
So, well, one thing that I've observed over my experience working in, especially in the US and Canada, the accommodation of providing larger font. It bothers me a little bit sometimes, to be honest with you, because it's not the solution for dyslexia. Larger font, fewer words on the page. Do you think this is enough accommodation?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
So I'm a visual scientist. As a visual scientist as well. It's not about so again, dyslexia was first described by an ophthalmologist, and this is kind of interesting in that it is very visually based. No matter how large the font is, it's the processing of the information. There are theories that suggest that dyslexia is a result of visual scanning, but these are older theories. There's also theories of different colored filters that help reading.
Yeah.
But that kind of have debunked, and so
it's still a mystery, huh? Dyslexia is considered a mystery.
It's a mystery. It's complicated. Reading is a very complicated thing.
And the accommodation I mentioned earlier, it's like if you're telling me something and I don't understand, so you help me by raising your voice.
Exactly. It's very blunt. I don't think
that helps. So, but we have to say that there are so many promising interventions. Research is being done on effective interventions, reading interventions for students who struggle in reading, especially dyslexia or autism or other developmental disabilities. So the research is happening, and we have the good news that, that's promising. Excellent. And now, would you like to add anything about this?
I just want to add one small thing is that, we don't have to have people labeled. Someone, a child doesn't necessarily have to be a special needs approach or a learning disability. Different children have different, strengths and so on. So some of these approaches can be used, like especially the approaches where we look at teaching strategies and things like that can really be used for all children, and find a way to make them enjoy reading, I think is very important, because it will help them with other things.
So you prefer using the term struggling readers as opposed to students who have this disability or that disability?
Exactly, yes. We don't need the labels to be able to engage in these supportive approaches.
Yeah, and to speak from the UAE context, for example, we are a multilingual culture, multilingual context. And so also learning to read and reading in other languages may present its own challenges. So this is why I prefer to say struggling readers as opposed to a student with a reading disability or reading impairment. So you have, because I know that you come from a culture that is also a context that is also multilingual.
Absolutely.
And we can benefit from your perspectives on that. What advice do you give us as a multicultural context?
Absolutely. So instruction in Montreal, Canada, is often mostly in French, sometimes mostly in English, and sometimes half the day is French, half the day is English, and sometimes years change. Plus, many Montrealers have a third language, so it's very multicultural. So sometimes when a learner is struggling and they're in a multilingual environment, it may be a decision that's made amongst everyone to maybe focus on one language over the other, to learn at least reading efficiency in one language. What I do want to say though is that sometimes if you're in an environment where you're learning two languages at once, some reading skills are maybe challenged. However, these kids have an extraordinary vocabulary that's often overlooked. So they sometimes, bilingual or maybe trilingual kids have a vocabulary that is just incredible. Much richer, taken together. And maybe the vocabulary in one language is smaller. So these are all like context that has to be considered when either assessing a child for a reading challenge or intervening, or even like placing the child in a specific environment that's best suited for them, right?
Amazing, yes. And Dr. Claudine, I think you want to add something.
Yeah, just something. So I think one thing that a lot of people kind of forget, or we need to remind ourselves, is that usually if someone has a difficulty in one language, we'll see that difficulty across the other languages as well. So it's not, and if you have fluency in one language, you'll usually have fluency, in the other languages. So I think maybe as important as it is to consider the different languages, I think it's also very important to consider how can we address whatever the difficulty is, and then whatever improvement will happen, we will see that across the other languages as well.
Wow.
So it's especially if we teach those strategies,
Absolutely. So I'll ask you a hypothetical question now then. So if I have a child who goes to Miss X for reading, for English, and Miss Y for Arabic, struggling in English big time, okay, to an extent where the English teacher thinks that he has dyslexia. But he's doing very well in the Arabic class, and he's learning how to read fluently with no problems. What do you think is happening in this child's brain?
So I like to maybe champion what Claudine is saying.
I don't think I've seen that.
So if there's an underlying neural difference in reading, it'll probably be presented across both languages. If this situation happens, as a clinician, I'd ask more questions.
Yeah.
And maybe
it's probably more social emotional or something.
Social emotional, another language, it's a second language.
Exactly.
So if I'm doing fine with the first language, learning how to read it, exposure to text, right?
Exposure to text is something else as well. Motivation.
Teaching practices.
Teaching environment.
And this is where I want to get to. Teaching practice.
Yeah, it could be that one teacher exactly has different practices or rapport with the student as well. So
absolutely, and many times you observe teachers teach reading, and you think, wow, that's exactly what research tells us we need to do, even though they haven't maybe read the articles or seen. But effective reading intervention or instruction is effective reading instruction. It's just basically good teaching, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So after we've talked about the importance of reading, we talked about the complex nature of reading and how it's a set of complex skills. We also talked about considerations for educators when it comes to teaching struggling readers. And now I'd like to take us to dyslexia, or the reading disorders or reading disabilities. And when we say dyslexia, we can now say disorders or disabilities. Even though Dr. Claudine said let's not label, and I understand, I totally agree with you. But in many, many cases, when a diagnosis is confirmed, then I prefer to use the label so that we can find the solution and the support. Okay? Unless you have something else you want to add.
I think it's important as far as it's all about it's child-centric, whatever is best for the child. And I think, again, you have proponents who use the medical model and those who wish not to. It depends on which tools you're using to make an assessment, and it depends. Like the DSM, for example.
I was saying we don't need the label. We don't have to. If the diagnosis is there, then of course use it to all. But if someone doesn't have a diagnosis, where if you've got a teacher, like you said, teaching practices, who takes the time to observe and notice that there might be something, then we shouldn't wait for the diagnosis or wait for the label to support the child.
And just for the audience, this is a long-lasting debate between scholars in special education and inclusive education, the medical model versus the capability-based model. Medical model meaning focusing on diagnosis, early intervention, treatment, using the words such as symptoms it has its advantages, and we like to use it when it's needed. But we also use, as you mentioned, and I heard in your talk earlier today, focus on capabilities, which is very, very important. Thank you for that. So my specific question about dyslexia, though, was not this. It was: studies that involve neuroimaging have shown that there are notable differences in the brain structure and functioning of a child with or individual with dyslexia, or individual who is considered neurodivergent or atypical neurodevelopment. What are these structural and functional differences, if you can help us understand that, for a child with dyslexia, for example?
Okay. So, again, reading is one of those few functions that is lateralized in the brain. So most of the auditory cortex, which is the primary receiving area for information, is lateralized. So a lot of the functions that are related to reading and speaking are lateralized. When we learn to read, we go from understanding the phonetic awareness, or this ability to understand how graphemes and phonemes are related, and then that becomes automatic, and then we're able to really understand words as they're seen. So it's kind of this progression from this phonetic type process to more of this automatic recognition of words and sentences. So that happens in the brain as well. So there's specific brain areas that are activated when phonetic tests or tasks are being presented, and those are closer to these primary receiving areas. So there's more simple areas. What happens over time is when reading becomes more automatic, the brain activation changes. It's more of the frontal areas, which kind of controls or reins in all these reading areas. So the shift in activation or function shifts from these more lower level areas that are really specific to word reading to higher level areas that kind of control. And it could be, for example, the ability to predict where to look, or predict where to look, how to look, etc. So the more automatic experience, this becomes like automatic, and then there's this other frontal areas that kind of mediate this more language-based or phonetic-based processing. So you see a shift behaviorally from phonetic processes to more automatic processes, and the same thing is mimicked in the brain. You see activation at earlier ages that are closer to the auditory cortex, that are more involved in parsing out and understanding the blocks of words and words themselves, to then that being automatized, and then higher level areas being more in control of the actual reading and reading comprehension. So the behavioral and brain kind of mimic each other with regards to development.
Yeah. Very well said. Now I have a clearer understanding of how the dyslexia brain works really, and how it progresses, how the functioning progresses.
So that's typically what happens. And maybe in the dyslexic brain, you could, again, you have to really push it to the limit.
Yes.
To find, Dr. Habak has done some imaging. You have to have the proper tasks and push the brain to the limit to see differences in how it develops atypically in dyslexia.
And Dr. Habak has, you have experience in that, right?
In imaging, yes. I did some brain imaging, not specific.
What about eye gaze? Is that related?
Yes, absolutely. So that eye, well, Dr. Armando was saying earlier that eye gaze can, but those are the older studies. A lot of the older studies pointed to maybe some differences in the way children with dyslexia would scan text, but that's less solid now.
Okay,
Yeah.
but did you know that you actually scan some of the later words in a sentence sometimes, right? The eye gaze tells us that when we're reading, you actually, your eyes, you read sometimes, you kind of skip ahead of yourself. Is that true?
So that is what Dr. Armando was saying about the kind of mechanics, the more the mechanics and more automated aspects of reading versus the comprehension aspects that rely more on the
Very interesting function, right? Very interesting. It's more like you're looking for the meaning, which will help you in your fluency in reading.
Absolutely. So the fluency in reading, it just once you have experience reading also, right? So you have these irregular words that you know what they mean,
Yeah.
right? It's incredible how quickly we could scan across printed text and understand the text. It's fascinating.
I'm going to give you an example that confirms exactly what you're saying, and it's related to Arabic. So Arabic
Yes.
reading. Are you familiar with the Arabic language?
Not as familiar as but I want, hopefully soon.
Yeah. For example, the word ilm, which means ilm, science. It means science. Ilm. It's actually 3 letters, right? But sometimes if you change it, something like an accent, haraka.
Yeah.
If when you change it, if it's ilm, it means something. If it's alam, it means something else. If it's alima, it's a verb. It's a different meaning, different word. So, and many times we don't have these harakat. We don't use them. It's kind of like how your name doesn't have an accent.
Yeah.
So and when we ask the child to read this word in a sentence, if the child is fluent enough and reading efficiently enough, he or she will be able to recognize which one of these 3 is meant to be read in this sentence. So it's almost like automatically I read the whole sentence and I understood it, and then I actually pronounced it.
Yeah.
So it all happens.
Sometimes the brain is filling in the blanks as you go off, and this is why the other cognitive skills then are so the energy and the cognitive, the processing, the processors, once the word phonetic processes are automatic, then you can really read much quicker, and then the other cognitive processes help, like working memory, for example, help you just read quickly and efficiently.
See, I really, it's a fascinating topic, very fascinating. And I'm going to thank my colleague, Dr. Abdelaziz, the example of alima, alam, ilm that actually came from Dr. Abdelaziz this morning. Okay, let's see. I think we are ready to move to the final question. Okay, ready? Okay, the final question is actually for all of us to discuss. Educators, because at the end of the day, and before I jump to this question, I wanted to emphasize the importance of practice. So this is an advice to all parents, educators, that practice, repeated exposure. Of course, after we've done the explicit systematic teaching, and practice and reading more, a variety of text, motivation related to reading, promoting motivation to read, is very, very important for automaticity, right? Yeah. So it's just, I wanted to leave this advice to all educators and parents. The last question, educators, parents, and caregivers want their children to progress, very important, from learning to read to reading to learn to enjoying reading. So learning to read, which happens very early on in school life, and then reading to learn, which is required later in social studies and science and math. But parents, we want our children to actually enjoy reading. What neuroscientific advice do you both have for us, for educators, parents, and caregivers, to reach this goal, this end goal, to fulfill this reading for joy?
Okay, I'll speak less as a neuroscientist on this one, and more as a parent or as a friend or as an instructor. I think the love of reading, it's of course, if one is predisposed to read as a hobby or as a I'm speaking about like reading a lot of text. It's incredible. It opens your mind. You could travel to different places without really moving. But I think it has to come from within.
From within,
I think. I do not judge persons who do not read a book a week, for example.
Okay, good.
It's I think a personal choice. So as far as a neuroscientist, I don't know. I think if as a neuroscientist, my interests are understanding how the brain works as far as reading, and maybe helping those who read less efficiently. And learning to reading to learn is super important as a parent as well. But then after that, I think the joy of reading is hopefully offered to everyone, and it's up to them to really read above and beyond like what a typical person should read during.
So as a parent, you didn't purposefully and intentionally, try your best for your child to become someone who enjoys reading. It's
enjoyment is enjoyment. Like as long as Monday morning, if my child is happy and wants to go to school, and that's the most important thing. And if they have a challenge, then I just hope that educators, professionals working with my child will help, them move forward.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate this advice, Dr. Armando. And Dr. Claudine, as a neuroscientist?
I'll take two hats today, but I think that I would actually. So we had this order. I think I would look at creating enjoyment of reading first.
Okay.
Yeah. So for when a parent just sitting down with your child, don't ask them questions. Don't turn the reading into a test. Exactly, right? Just
stop.
Exactly. How fast can you read this? So just sit down and just enjoy the moment and give them that pleasure, and let's just discuss the story. And where this kind of does tie into brain science is that we have, we kind of have in the brain, we have these main pathways, kind of connections for different functions, as Dr. Armando said earlier. So we have these different functions, and we have main pathways, kind of like a highway. We can take the Highway 11 to go from Abu Dhabi and Dubai. But then we also have lots of little, smaller roads that bring in other networks, like for example, a emotional network or a good memory or something, something like that. And then you can use all of those smaller paths to feed into that main road, and that will actually, through that enjoyment and all those other paths, those other roads to get there, actually do help with the main, with reading, for example.
I personally appreciate the message you gave. It's very vivid, and it helps you really. They talk about brain connections. I never get that. Okay, connections, jurisdictions.
Exactly. So like you said, you've got kind of more visual areas of reading and more auditory areas of reading. So. And then its connections is exactly different. So it's really, if you think about it, you can think of roads kind of going through all that, and you've got your main roads, but you also have all the smaller roads that get there as well. So it might take you a bit longer to get there on a small road than on the highway, but you'll get there, and it'll help strengthen.
But in general, is more connections better?
Not necessarily. It's more streamlined connections is.
Yeah, the connections, as we age, we actually, there's a pruning of connections, and it's, again, I'm fascinated with the brain in that certain networks maybe have less connection, but are super specialized.
Because they're very efficient.
They're very efficient, so you don't need the extra highways.
So you look for efficiency, not quantity of connection.
Exactly.
The part of our skull, I always tell this when I give my lectures, in our skull is the most valuable real estate in the world is what's in your skull. This is why your brain maximizes its space. So it's all about efficiency and maximizing that space rather than just having a whole bunch of...
Thank you so much for this analogy. It helps, actually. So I'm going to go back. We did track off a little bit from reading, but this is only normal because talking about the brain is so fascinating and it takes us to many, many different topics. Enjoying reading, okay? And there, I just want to focus that we highlight this need to develop enjoyment of reading in children. Now I'm trying to analyze it, so I'd like to hear your comment on it. It's because it's almost like we're trying to avoid dislike for reading. It's because we're too concerned that our children will not like reading, will avoid reading, which will affect academic performance negatively. So this is why, as a reaction, we kind of like make efforts to help them enjoy reading. Do you agree with this? Do you think this is what's going on?
Everybody wants their child to do everything really well. So, and if I have I have a friend over and their child is reading a book and my child is not reading a book and doing something else, I'll say, you know what? I might say, that maybe that child will be advantaged. That's a knee-jerk reaction. I'll take that route maybe. For me, it's okay if someone's passion is not reading. It's important that they read for their personal fulfillment and again have the tools to read efficiently to get them to where they want to be, whether it's in a fun place, whether it's in a fantasy world reading a sci-fi book, or whether it's becoming a lawyer who has to read tons and tons of books. So it all depends on, I guess, personal goals. So as a parent, maybe that's my style. I've always been like a hands-off and just making, again, this personal perspective, but making my kids do what they want. And one reads quite a bit and one doesn't.
Yeah.
So and that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah. That's okay as long as we get the function out of reading. So reading a grocery shopping list has a different function than reading a sci-fi book. So I want to teach I want the function of reading.
Especially with the prices today. It's very important that you read
for the grocery list very well, and also to find alternatives. What's synonyms for this word, so alternatives for that word. So see how the function of reading a grocery list is different than the function of reading a law book to be able to win a case.
And just maybe one final point: the more you read, it's absolutely evident that your vocabulary will increase, and it's just that's for sure, right? So, and then the more you read, the more vocabulary you have, and then again, if you're doing some sort of test, sometimes you might outperform someone who doesn't read as much because of your extended vocabulary. So that's maybe one example of someone of equal capacities across the board, but one who reads a lot of books and one that doesn't. Whether it's for pleasure, right? Mostly for pleasure, they'll have an extended vocabulary, which is much greater than that doesn't read, the person who doesn't read as much. Yeah.
Thank you. And Dr. Claudine, you have something to add about this?
No, again, make it fun, not too much pressure. It's kind of like when, as parents, a lot of people, insist that the children eat their vegetables, and there's this huge pressure to eat vegetables, and then the children eat less vegetables because of all the pressure to eat vegetables. So he said hands off, they take the pressure off and maybe, either model it or just sit. And I think modeling is a big thing as well. If children see a caregiver enjoying reading, then they might take that habit up a little bit as well. So yeah, and again, just making it fun. Just say, let's look at this story and focus on the story more than on the act of reading.
The act of reading. So this is just very valuable advice to give at the end of this episode, which is model good reading habits, right? Model that reading is fun. That needs modeling as well. I can be reading smiling as opposed to reading and so model reading and also focus on that reading has a function. At the end of the day, the ultimate goal of reading is reading comprehension. It's text, I want to get the meaning out of the text. So also focusing on reading comprehension is very important. So a child carrying a book and reading alone is not enough, right? So I teach reading. It could be
enough. You never know. Yeah.
So I guess the episode is like that.
If a child is reading a book, be happy. Very
happy. Exactly. Absolutely. This is amazing. Well-being of the children is really our ultimate goal. Well-being now at the present and well-being in the future. So promoting reading skills will help them now and also help them become better individuals and more efficient contributors to the society. Thank you so much, Dr. Armando and Dr. Claudine. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Very good to be here.
Thank you.